I hate the fact that my hair is getting longer because now, if I'm moving around a lot in my sleep or if my pillowcase decides to frizz up my hair, then, yeah, this happens. It's not even just like an alfalfa, it's literally like a whole head alfalfa. There we go, toss on the Call of Duty hat. That should hopefully fix it up a bit. But anyway, mini consoles. Let's talk about them. I apologize if there's any misinformation in this video because, well, right now I'm just looking at the wiki page because we all know that wiki is a totally reliable source of information. Atari 10, oh my gosh, I had this thing! It's obviously outside the realm of what we're talking about, but today I specifically wanted to talk about the wave of mini consoles that we saw from like 2016 to like 2019 and then just never again. They just all fell off the face of the planet, and it sucks because they got cut off at a time when it was about to get really good. The last one that came out was the Sega Genesis Mini, but just before that we had like the PlayStation Classic, which means we were getting into that generation of Sega Saturn, Sega Dreamcast, Nintendo 64. And the best part about these mini consoles is that obviously it wasn't FPGA hardware. Like, they weren't just, reconfiguring PlayStation 1 chips and S chips and then putting out these consoles again, basically just in a mini form factor, but rather it was just really good emulation. And since that's how it was built, the chips that were going into these were actually more capable than the original systems, obviously. So for example, on the Super Nintendo Mini, you could actually emulate Nintendo 64 games on there. I had to double check that one, and not only, it actually wasn't just the SNES Mini, it was actually also the NES Classic, which, yeah, that's kind of funny seeing N64 games run on a NES, even if it is just all emulation. But I guess we'll just kind of go in order here. Now, there is unfortunately only a handful of these devices listed. Oh, never mind, they do have a bit of a bigger thing down here, because there is some that are missing on here, like for example the TurboGrafx 16 Mini. So I remember the NES Classic had 30 games. We'll go ahead and run through them now. So it had, we're just gonna be doing like the NA/PAL versions, by the way. Balloon Fight, Bubble Bobble, Castlevania, Castlevania 2, Simon's Quest, Donkey Kong, Donkey Kong Jr., Double Dragon 2, The Revenge. Kind of funny they got Double Dragon 2 on there, not the first one, but is what it is. Dr. Mario, Excitebike, Final Fantasy, the first one, but not Final Fantasy 3, because obviously Final Fantasy 3 didn't exist in North America until the remake on the DS, and then later we got the Pixel remasters and all that. But then Galaga, Ghosts and Goblins, Gradius, Ice Climber, Kid Icarus, Kirby's Adventure, The Legend of Zelda, Mario Bros. And by the way, let me just say, Kid Icarus on the Nintendo, and the NES Mini, that was basically the last time that a Kid Icarus game would have been sold by Nintendo, technically speaking. Obviously, it's on the Nintendo Switch Online. You can go in there and play Kid Icarus on there. But in terms of a product that they were actually selling that you could buy physically, even though, yes, we had Kid Icarus on the 3DS, I'm just talking about the last time Nintendo would have published something Kid Icarus relating. I'm pretty sure this was literally the last time. Kirby's Adventure, Legend of Zelda, Mario Bros, Mega Man 2, Metroid, Ninja Gaiden, Pac-Man, Punch-Out featuring Mr. Dream, Star Tropics, Super Contra, Super Mario Bros 2, 3, Tecmo Bowl, and Zelda 2, The Adventure of Link. And this is what I found to be so interesting, right? Like, so as I mentioned before, it obviously wasn't like an FPGA system, it was just a system on a chip, aka emulation, and apparently this had the all-winner R16 quad-core ARM Cortex-A7, which was a lot more advanced than the original NES back in the day. It had 256 megabytes of DDR3 RAM, which is obviously, just to put this in perspective, the most that an NES cartridge could hold was 1 megabyte. So an entire game, it had enough RAM technically to store 256 NES games, just quantitatively speaking, in terms of the storage, and it had 512 megabytes, so that's not important. Graphics, Mali 400 MP, so this was a rather capable system, and this thing was so cool. I remember back at the time when these things were releasing, there was so much excitement and talk like, oh my gosh, are we about to see like a whole wave of these mini consoles coming out? Maybe this could lead to, I don't know, some lesser known franchises getting the recognition that they deserve, leading to maybe more games, like for example a game like Kid Icarus. Unfortunately, that ended up not being the case because the last game we got was still Uprising on the 3DS, but nonetheless, I just remember how cool it was when these things released. Everybody wanted to get one, and each of these systems sold really well, which is why it's even more confusing as to why they just stopped, because clearly they were literally just printing money with this. You make a really cheap chip, you give it the similar form factor, just really small, you re-release the controller, and you can make an insane profit by upcharging on this thing. They were literally printing money with with it, and yet they stopped making these things. In terms of the emulation quality, at least on the Nintendo side of things, which is something that we'll get to then, it was pretty good. Nintendo has always had their emulation game down. Like, even now on the Nintendo Switch, for example, like, you play some of the more higher-end consoles, at least in terms of emulation on that device, and you look at the Nintendo 64, and it runs great on there. I mean, you would hope so, considering it's the Nintendo Switch, and, you know, it has some pretty decent specs, and even, like, a modern Android phone could handle that with no problem, but still. And when it comes to the game selection, again, they had a pretty good selection there. I mean, they had basically all of their first-party IPs represented, barring a few games, or a few games that I feel like probably could have been on there when we're considering, like, the best of the best for NES. Obviously, there's always going to be some issues when it comes to licensing. You know, there's going to, like, for example, if you wanted a game like Batman the video game, which in my opinion is one of the best NES games, not only graphically speaking, but also gameplay-wise, it is just a very fun and engaging experience, but unfortunately, it wasn't able to be on there because it was a tie-in game for the Batman 1989 movie, which, let me also just say that that is one of my favorite movies of all time, and definitely one of my favorite superhero movies of all time. But licensing aside, and when it comes to the first-party offerings, I feel like we had a pretty good selection there. So now we're going to go ahead and move on to the Super Nintendo, which is actually, unfortunately, the only mini console that I have, just because, you know, normally when I play games, I just want to play it on original hardware anyway, but this is one that my mom actually ended up buying a few years ago, and then I've just kind of been holding on to, and by holding on to, I just mean, you know, keeping captive in my room and playing from time to time, especially because, you know, there's, like, younger kids out there, so I'm keeping it safe for my mom. But as I just mentioned, I do get a lot of use out of this thing, because this thing is really cool. So here is the Super Nintendo Mini. Like, look, it literally fits in the palm of my hand. If you remember how the original Super Nintendo was back in the day, it was a bit more like, something more like this, you know what I mean? It was definitely a bit of a heftier system, but this, again, just kind of, like, just fits in your hand just like that. And then the controller itself is literally a complete replica of the original thing. Like, the Super Nintendo that I had as a kid compared to this, it is literally 1-to-1. Maybe the original controller had a bit more heft. Like, this one feels a little bit lighter maybe than the original, and the port on the end is a bit different because, for those that don't know, you can actually plug this into the end of your Wiimote and use it for, you know, like the classic games on there, for example. So if you're on the Wii or even the Wii U and you want to play one of the Virtual Console games, you could do it with this, or any of the other mini consoles that had a plug like this, like the NES. And when it comes to the capabilities of these things, you can really open it up once you go ahead and mod it, which... that's what I did. Once you mod a system, obviously you can add more emulators, you can add more games to it. I don't want to go into the specifics of what I did with my modded system in particular, because I don't want Nintendo knocking on my door, but I did modify it, did tinker with some things, and it's a really cool experience. Not to mention the layout of the systems, like when you turn the system on and you got all the games there, like I love the way that it's listed out. I love the music that plays at the menu. It's just so Nintendo. The Super Nintendo is also the first console that I played on as a kid, so I just have a lot of love and nostalgia for that system in general. It's always been one of my favorite consoles. But in terms of the list of games actually on the console, this is where I would say, even though there's less titles, because this one only has 21 titles compared to the NES, which had 30, the selection here is on fire. Now granted, there was a lot of omissions and a lot of games that I really feel like should have been on here, but for the games that are on here, and considering the price that it released for at the time, I'd say it was worth it. So, we got Contra 3 The Alien Wars, all-time classic, Donkey Kong Country, all-time classic, Earthbound, F-Zero, Final Fantasy V, Kirby Superstar, Kirby's Dream Course, The Legend of Zelda, A Link to the Past, probably my favorite Zelda. It goes back and forth between that and Ocarina of Time, Mega Man X, Secret of Mana, Star Fox 2, a never-before-released game that was, you know, the most we knew about Star Fox 2 was a few leaks over the years, some inklings, some concept art, just, you know, some stuff like this, just very bare bones, we really didn't have a lot. And then here comes Nintendo, just dropping the entire game of all places here on the Super Nintendo Mini. Street Fighter 2 Turbo, Hyper Fighting, one of the 54 editions of Street Fighter 2. Super Castlevania 4, Super Ghouls and Ghosts, Super Mario Kart, Super Mario RPG, Legend of the Seven Stars, which was actually a collaborative effort between Nintendo and Square Enix, or what actually would have been Squaresoft back in the day, and it is an experience unlike any other. And when they announced that they were doing the Super Mario RPG remake a few years ago, that was something that I never thought was going to happen, right? Just because obviously it was a collaborative effort, as I mentioned before, between like Square Enix, you know, Square Enix now, and Nintendo. And obviously both of those companies are still around. Obviously everybody still holds the licenses to everything that they need to, but it's just one of those things where I feel like Nintendo in recent years has been very in-house with a lot of things. Very rarely, using their IPs with different things. You have a few rare examples like Mario and Rabbids. Not to mention how many pop culture references were in Super Mario RPG, and thankfully some of those were kind of retained, but not really in that remake. I always loved the art style in that game too. Sort of that, what do you want to call it? Almost like claymation looking thing. Like, it was so cool. I adore the art style in that game. It is one of my favorite art styles of any video game that I've ever played. Like, it's way up there. So seeing that on there was not only really cool, but honestly just really surprising too. And Super Mario RPG, whether you play the original or the remake, you really can't go wrong either way. It's a fantastic game. Highly recommend it. Then you had Super Mario World, obviously, Super Metroid, obviously, Super Punch-Out, and Yoshi's Island. So again, you know, that's 21 games there, and even though it's 9 less than what we had on the NES, I would say that when it comes to the selection of games and just the amount of playtime they're going to get out of all of these games, you know, again, you look at something like Final Fantasy VI. I'm sorry, I said Final Fantasy V before, I meant to say Final Fantasy VI. You got that, Donkey Kong Country, Contra, all the Mario games. Like, seriously, there's so much to chew in here. Secret of Mana, man, that game will last you for a while. Unfortunately, again, this is another situation where I wish there were some more games on here. Like, where's Chrono Trigger? Like, come on, you're gonna do a SNES Mini and you don't have Chrono Trigger? What about Turtles in Time? Again, I know there's licensing issues there, but still, man, it's Turtles in Time. That is one of my, I'm gonna say it, it's one of my top 5 Super Nintendo games, I think. I mean, my top 5 would kind of like switch and sway depending on my mood, I suppose, because there is a lot of great games on the system, but still, man. However, this unfortunately takes us to the dark ages of mini consoles. So we had, you know, the 2016 NES Mini and the 2017 SNES Classic. Which then leads us to the 2018 PlayStation Classic, December 3rd, 2018. Now, let's just go ahead and go over the list of games, because the games on here are good, like very good. It's a pretty good selection, but there's some very obvious omissions that will become quite evident as soon as I start listing games. Okay, so first things first, there is no games, I repeat, because this all goes in alphabetical order, no games from A. There is no Ape Escape. There is no Armored Core. Nothing that starts with an A is featured here. But we go to B, Battle Arena Toshinden. Well, what else? That's it. No. Think of any amazing game that starts with a B for the PlayStation 1. It's not here. Let's go down to C. Cool Borders 2 and Destruction Derby. Yup. No Crash Bandicoot. We go down to F. We have Final Fantasy VII. Thank goodness, but no 8 or 9, which... okay. Grand Theft Auto 1, okay, good, but again, still no other games that start with G or anything in between there, no E's. Intelligent Cube, Jumping Flash, Metal Gear Solid, okay. Mr. Driller, Oddworld Abe's Odyssey, okay, good. Parasite Eve was unfortunately only in Japan, so, you know, we didn't get that on our PlayStation Classic, but, you know. Ridge Racer Type 4, okay. Rayman, yeah. Resident Evil Director's Cut, thank God they didn't do the DualShock version. Whatever that music was in the kitchen, dude, it was terrible. Revelations Persona from Atlas, Super Puzzle Fighter 2 Turbo, Siphon Filter, Tekken 3, Tom Clancy's Rainbow Six, Twisted Metal, Wild Arms. Like, okay, the list ends off with a bang, but again, Spyro the Dragon, Crash Bandicoot. What about any of the other 3D platformers of the day? Where's my Gex? Where's my Croc? Gran Turismo? Like, Sony's flagship racing game? Wait, let me just go through this again. Yeah, there was literally no Gran Turismo. Like, come on now. That is one of the best games on the PlayStation 1. Where is it? Resident Evil 2? Resident Evil 3? Not here. Tony Hawk's Pro Skater? I know there's licensing things, but still. What about Soul Reaver? Silent Hill? Castlevania? Symphony of the Night? If Nintendo could pull off some of these things, why can't PlayStation? Dino Crisis? Breath of Fire? Like, come on now. But this, unfortunately, is not the worst part. Okay, so, oh my gosh, oh my gosh, I can't believe they messed this up this bad. The PlayStation Classic, for those that don't know back in the day, okay, there was a distinct difference between US games and PAL games, and that was the fact that EU TVs, or PAL TVs, ran at 50 Hertz, aka 50 frames per second, and that was a hard cap. And when it came to American TVs, they ran at 60 Hertz as they always have, you know, 60 FPS. And if you don't know anything about Hertz or frame rates or anything like that, you might hear like, oh, 50 FPS, 50 Hertz, whatever, like that still sounds good, right? Yeah, but no, there's this thing, when you're running a game on a certain display, this goes to resolutions and frame rates, for the best possible, most fluent, and most responsive experience. I'm not saying you're going to have a bad experience or that's going to be inherently terrible if you don't do it this way. When it comes to resolutions, you typically want to have it being within a multiplier of sorts, right? Like if you're going to play 240p TV or a 240p game, you'd probably get the best looking, no, you definitely get like the best looking experience playing it on a 720p TV versus playing it on 1080p. Likewise, if for, okay, here's actually more of a modern example that really applies. You know how there's like 40 FPS modes in games? You typically don't want to use those on a 60 Hz display, and it's better to use those on a 120 Hz display because it's actually going to feel smoother and more responsive overall on the 120 Hz than it would on the 60 Hz. And that's not even just because, oh, bigger Hertz, bigger number. It's just because that 40 FPS divides evenly into the Hertz. But here, 50 Hz to 60 Hz, you can't make 50 divide evenly into 60, which meant that not only was the frame rate lower, but the overall responsiveness and feeling of the game just wasn't right. It was running slower in some instances, and in some cases where games were actually tied to their frame rates in terms of the ways that certain things responded in game, whether that be physics, overall game speed, mechanics in the game, it could literally break some games. And it's not like this thing couldn't, handle running the PS1 games at the full 60 Hz, so it's not like they chose this just because of sheer performance. I guess they just chose it for some reason. I honestly have no idea. In terms of the specs, I mean, we're looking at a quad-core ARM Cortex A35 for the CPU. In terms of the memory, 1GB of DDR3 RAM. In terms of the graphics, we have a PowerVR GE8300, which honestly, I've never heard of that. Maybe they would have been better off going for like a Mali GPU, but I mean, even then, it clearly was able to run the games. If you're already pushing 50 FPS, it's not going to take that much more power to push it to 60, so they either could have just went with the American copies of games, which they should have to begin with, or maybe beefed up the power inside of it. I'm really not sure like what the reason was for this, but that was the reason why this console was so bad, because it's not even like a thing of like, oh, people are just being dramatic, 50 Hz instead of 60, boo-hoo, the games run at 10 FPS lower. It's not even that. It's the fact that it would literally just like break some games and make them play in a way that was just not intended to be played, or make them unresponsive to a way that was actually a hindrance on the gameplay, or just give you the not intended experience. Overall, I feel like the PlayStation Classic was one of the many nails in the coffin for the whole mini console thing, because after the PlayStation Classic, things really slowed down after that. Like, going back to the list here, again, we had the TurboGrafx 16 Mini, the Atari Flashback X, and like the Sega Genesis Mini, but outside of that, that was like basically it. So we'll go ahead and look at the Atari Flashback X, which I'm gonna be honest, I don't know a whole lot about this system. The Atari Flashback X, released in 2019, attempted to capitalize on the mini console trend. The basic model included 2 wired controllers and 110 games. The deluxe edition included 10 additional games, so we're not going to run through that entire list, but like that's pretty good. 110 games. Sure, they're Atari games, which means they're going to be a bit more simple. You got stuff like Pitfall, which tried to kind of break the mold to be a bit more complex, but for the most part, Atari games are much more arcadey, a bit more simplistic. You got stuff like Pong, which is actually a really fun Atari game, which then takes us to, we will save the Sega Genesis Mini for last, actually, because that one is a bang. But we're gonna go over here to the TurboGrafx 16 Mini, which honestly in itself is also a bit of a bang. The TurboGrafx in itself, aka the PC Engine, is a very underrated console that I wish more people knew about. The system did get more recognition from like the Virtual Console, for example, but unfortunately it's still just a very underrated system. If you want a recommendation from me, this one is specifically for the TurboGrafx 16 CD or the PCE CD, but I would highly recommend the Ys Games, aka YS. I don't know how you're actually supposed to pronounce that, but it's just spelled YS. Absolutely fantastic games, cannot recommend it enough, but there's a ton of great games on the TurboGrafx. So if we can just kind of run through the list here, we got Air Zong, Aldines, Alien Crush, Pair Gate Ball, Blazing Lasers, Bomberman 93 and 94, Bomberman Panic Bomber, Bonk's Adventure, Bonk's Revenge, Kadash, Castlevania, Rondo of Blood, Chu Man Fu, China Warrior, Cho, Aniki, Dragon Spirit, Dungeon Explorer, Fantasy Zone, Galaga 88, love that game, the Genji and the Heike clans, Ghouls and Ghosts, Ginga Fuke, Densetsu, Sapphire, Gradius 2, Gopher no Yabo, JJ and Jeff, Jasai Ken, Necromancer, The Legend of Valkyrie, Lords of Thunder, Military Madness, Moto Rotor, Newtopia 2, New Adventure Island, and it just keeps going. Ninja Gaiden, Ninja Spirit, Parasol Stars, Power Golf, Psychosis, R-Type, love that game, love R-Type, dude. Salamander, Sirei Senshi, Spriggan, Snatcher, Soldier Blade, Space Harrier, Splatterhouse, yeah, Splatterhouse, Spriggan Mark II, Re-Terraform Project, Star Parodier, Super Darius, love that game too. Super Momotaro, Dentetsu 2, Superstar Soldier, Victory Run, and Yeast Book 1 and 2, which is the one that I was talking about. Definitely check that game out. But when it came to this system, unlike the PlayStation 1 Classic, this one knocked it out of the park in terms of emulation, games, the controller, like everything about this system was just great. Oh, that's something I forgot to mention about the PS1 Classic. It didn't come with the DualShock 1. No, it came with the original controller where it just had the D-pad and the buttons, which that's probably why we didn't see games like Ape Escape, for example, or other games that relied on the DualShock. But at that point, why couldn't you just release the DualShock? You had not only half of the PS1 generation that had the DualShock controller already, but then you had the PS2 generation with the DualShock, the PS3 that had the DualShock. It probably would have been easier for them just to do a shell swap with some other broken DualShock and just put some of those on the PlayStation Classic. Like, you know what I mean? I don't get it, man. Why would you go through all this and just make it so restrictive? Like, I could understand if they were just trying to go for that, oh, day one experience of playing the PlayStation 1, but you have games on there like Final Fantasy VII, which were obviously not part of that day one experience. That came a few years after the PlayStation 1 release. Like, what are we even talking about? Why couldn't you just do the DualShock? Like, here's the thing. The fact that it didn't come with a DualShock, I don't think played into the fact that the system was just kind of DOA, and because that really just comes down to the emulation quality, because for some reason they decided to go with PAL copies, which in the modern landscape wouldn't be a big deal because everything just runs at 60 hertz. But back then, I mean, come on, dude. Like, there was people that aren't even that in the know when it comes to, like, hertz and frame rates and such that were able to play these games on the PlayStation Classic and be like, huh, this doesn't feel right. Or like, huh, that doesn't play like it does on my PS1, or, huh, this feels like shit. Now, obviously, there was also a couple other mini consoles along the way, but I'm just trying to touch on the main plot points here just to kind of do a brief retrospective look at these things. So, this leads us on to the Sega Genesis Mini, which, like I said, we're going out with a bang here, so strap in. Alex Kidd in the Enchanted Castle, Alicia Dragoon, Altered Beast, Beyond Oasis, Castle of Illusion, starring Mickey Mouse. That is an awesome game right there. Castlevania Bloodlines, Columns, Comic Zone, Contra Hardcore, Darius, Dr. Robotnik's Mean Bean Machine, Earthworm Jim, Dynamite Headdy, sorry, I went in reverse order there. Okay, Dynamite Headdy, Earthworm Jim, Echo the Dolphin, Eternal Champions, Ghouls and Ghosts, Golden Axe, Gunstar Heroes, Kid Chameleon, Landstalker, The Treasures of King Noel, Light Crusader, Mega Man The Wily Wars, Monster World 4, Phantasy Star 4, The End of the Millennium. That is a fantastic game right there. Road Rash 2, Shining Force, Shinobi 3, Return of the Ninja Master, Sonic Spinball, Sonic the Hedgehog 2, 3, Space Harrier 2, Street Fighter 2 Special Champion Edition. Unfortunately, Sonic the Hedgehog 3 and Knuckles wasn't on here for some reason, probably just due to the weird licensing music controversy. Everybody knows about that at this point, right? Streets of Rage 2, Shrider, Super Fantasy Zone, Tetris, Thunder Force 3, Toe Jam and Earl, Vector Man, Virtual Fighter 2, Wonder Boy, and Monster World. World of Illusion, and yeah, that's the list of games. So, like, when it comes to a mini system, that is absolutely fantastic, not to mention the fact that not only did we have the first Genesis Mini, but we also had a Genesis Mini 2. The Sega Genesis Mini 2 features 53 games released for both the Genesis and the Sega CD add-on peripheral. Now, unfortunately, I don't think we ever saw any 32X games in here. I mean, that's kind of okay, I guess, because there wasn't that many 32X games to begin with, but it's still kind of unfortunate. However, thankfully, we did get some Sega CD games, so we'll just go ahead and kind of run through everything that we got here again in America. Afterburner 2, just starting off with a bang, Afterburner 2, Alien Soldier, Atomic Runner Chelnov, Bonanza Bros, Clay Fighter, Crusader of Senti, Desert Strike, Return to the Gulf, Devi NP, Earthworm Jim 2, Echo the Dolphin, Echo the Tides of Time, Elemental Master, Fantasy Zone, Fatal Fury 2, Final Fight CD, is this, yeah, Game Ground, Golden Axe 2, Granada, Hellfire, Herzog Sway, however you're supposed to pronounce that, Mansion of Hidden Souls, Midnight Resistance, Night Striker, Night Trap, absolute classic game right there. The Ninja Warriors, the Ooze, Outrunners, Phantasy Star 2, Populous, Rainbow Islands Extra, Ranger X, The Revenge of Shinobi, Restar, Robo Aleste, Rolling Thunder 2. Sorry, I'm just trying to scroll around because they have it listed out really weird on here. Sewer Shark, Shadow Dancer, The Secret of Shinobi, Shining Force CD, Shining Force 2, Shining in the Darkness, Silpede, Sonic 3D Blast, Sonic CD, which honestly, if I'm going to say anything, Sonic CD is probably one of the most underrated Sonic games. I rarely hear people talk about it, even though it's a great Sonic game. Like, I genuinely love that game. Space Harrier 2, Splatter, Splatterhouse 2, Star Mobile, once again, just scrolling around the weird way they have this labeled here. Streets of Rage 3, Classic, Super Hang-On, Super Locomotive, Super Street Fighter 2, The New Challengers, again, one of the many editions of Street Fighter 2. Thunder Force 4, Toe Jam and Earl, and Panic on Funkotron. For some reason that made me think of Funko Pops. Truxton, Vectorman 2, Viewpoint, Virtual Racing, VS Puyo Puyo Sun, and finally War Song. So, when it comes to the overall amount of games, obviously there's more on the Mini 2, though I would say that the Mini 1 probably had the overall bang for buck when it just comes to getting all of the go-to Genesis classics on one system. Again, there's still some obvious omissions here, like I feel like the Aladdin game would have been really cool to see on here, but again, you got some of the licensing issues, and there's just like a handful of other games that you could really list out that could have been on here. But regardless, for what games are on here, especially when it comes to that Mini 1, I mean, come on, man, so many classics. And unfortunately, beyond that point, that's kind of where things dried up. If we're looking through the timeline here, I mean, we had a few things here, right? Like, we have some arcade one-up things, like a Mega Man collection, Pac-Man collection. We had the Atari flashbacks we already talked about, but even then, you know, those systems are kind of dead and gone since now we have the 2600 Plus and the 7800 Plus, which the 7800 Plus would really be the ultimate Atari system since you can play 5200 and 2600 games on there, and obviously 7800 games. And then in terms of that, yeah, like, again, we've seen a few things here and there. Oh, the Dance Dance Revolution Classic Mini. But that's not, you know, it's not like the same thing like the NES Classic or the SNES Classic. And I really do feel like, I don't know if it was necessarily the PlayStation Classic that started this downturn and this kind of like waning interest in mini consoles, or if it's just because every publisher and previous console maker, by previous console maker, I'm referring to obviously to like Atari and Sega, you know, throwing their hat in the ring and trying to get in on the nostalgia and be like, oh man, check out these mini systems, they got all these games from your childhood, go and pick them up. So, you know, maybe, I don't know if it was a thing where it was just kind of saturating the market too quickly, because all of these systems, like, again, the NES, NES, PlayStation Classic, Atari Flashback X, Sega Genesis Mini, TurboGrafx 16, all hit the market within like 5 years of each other, on top of all the other mini consoles and retro systems that are always out there. Obviously, a lot of the other ones that are like more third party are usually of a questionable quality. You know, you got the, the AT Games machines. But it is sad, because these devices, they were really cool, and I would like them. I would like to see at least a few more. I don't think we really need to go that much farther. Like, I don't think Sony needs to do another one, unless they wanted to do good by their fans and release a classic console that was actually, like, good this time, with actually, like, you know, the proper games running at 60 hertz. But, you know, otherwise, outside of that, you know, when it comes to Nintendo, I'd really love to see them do maybe a Game Boy Classic. Could you imagine that? Like a handheld like this? Maybe not the mini form factor. Maybe just keep the original form factor, but give it like an actual, you know, LCD or LED screen this time, just so that, you know, we don't have to get those attachments where you put the light over the screen just to be able to see it if it's not light enough outside. So, you know, like a Game Boy Classic Mini, whatever you want to call it, a Game Boy Advance Classic or Mini, I think would be cool, because even though that system did come out in the 2000s, and it is technically a 32-bit system, it was usually running 16-bit aesthetic games or Super Nintendo remakes, so I feel like that would work really well and still kind of, you know, there would still be a point to doing it, because I feel like once you start getting into the PlayStation 2 generation and the GameCube generation, I mean, I feel like people would still go crazy over a mini console like that, but I feel like, I don't know, realistically speaking, since we're still seeing a lot of remakes of games from that era, I feel like it would be a little while until we would actually see that, because you look at some examples like the Resident Evil 4 remake, just to kind of, you know, one off the top of my head there. Obviously, that's a game from that generation, so I don't think we would see a mini console from that generation for a bit yet, just because, you know, the publishers are still trying to remake those games. So once they get to remake those games, and once we get a bit farther out, maybe we could see something like that in the future if these kind of consoles ever, you know, make a comeback. But again, even if we would have got up to the N64 generation, which we technically kind of did, just not in the best circumstances with the PlayStation Classic, the amount of games that could have been on there, man. Donkey Kong 64, Kirby 64, Mario 64, Mario Kart 64, Ocarina of Time, Majora's Mask. The list goes on and on with the amount of classic N64 games. It'd be cool to see something like Perfect Dark or GoldenEye on there, but I don't know if we'd actually see that on there, just again because of licensing. I feel like Perfect Dark would be more likely than GoldenEye, because obviously GoldenEye getting into all the movies and stuff, whereas with Perfect Dark, I feel like Nintendo could probably work something out with Microsoft and Rare, since Microsoft has been putting all their games on other systems anyway. But regardless, that would have been really cool to see. Then we get to the Sega Saturn Saturn, obviously there was a lot of classic games on there. Even if they would, for example, just put on some of the games that we already would have seen on like the PlayStation 1, like for example, Resident Evil was on Sega Saturn, so that could be really cool to see there, or like Panzer Dragoon. And then we get to the Dreamcast, and I mean, come on, man, it's the Dreamcast, Sonic Adventure, Shenmue. Whoa, did you guys hear that whistle right there? Shenmue, Resident Evil Code Veronica. The list is literally endless with the amount of Dreamcast games you could pull from. But at this point, unfortunately, I think that is all wishful thinking, because right now we're kind of in the era of subscription services and other things like that. PlayStation has their subscription service, though thankfully they do allow you to buy their games outright, so that's really nice. Xbox has had their subscription service for ages, and then obviously I think Nintendo is probably going to go even further with the whole Nintendo Switch Online thing next generation. I'm assuming their next generation system is going to be capable enough of emulating PlayStation 2/GameCube generation games, you know, considering the fact that my crappy knockoff Android phone can emulate PS2 and GameCube games, I'm sure the next Switch will be able to. So I'm sure they're probably, if I had to guess, they're either going to keep remaking games from that generation, or they're going to add an even more expensive tier, or just raise the price of the already more expensive tier of their Nintendo Switch Online service, that being the expansion pack service, which right now goes for $50 a year. I feel like that might raise that up to like $60 or $80 if they throw GameCube in there, which honestly I feel like it would be worth it, just considering how many GameCube games they could add on there. I mean, even if you just look at the first-party Nintendo offerings, you got stuff like Super Mario Sunshine, you know, Mario Kart, Wind Waker, Smash Bros, and that's not even to mention any of the third-party offerings that they could put on there. So yeah, I feel like the possibilities are actually kind of endless there if they would actually do that, and if they would start to include some of the classic Pokemon games on there, which I'm really confused as to why they haven't done that yet. Like, even if they just put Pokemon, the first generation on the Game Boy app, but like Pokemon Red, Blue, and maybe even Yellow, Pokemon Coliseum, once again, the possibilities are just literally endless if Nintendo would really want to go that route. I do still wish there was a way to actually just purchase the games outright, besides just, you know, because right now you have to have the subscription service in order to be able to access those games. So if they could give you a way to actually purchase the games like how Sony and Xbox do, you know, I feel like that would be a nice middle ground and would be seriously appreciated. But either way, I'm just glad that those games are available to begin with, and I'm really excited for what Nintendo might do with the Switch 2 when it comes to like all the Nintendo Switch Online stuff, and just what any of these other console holders do when it comes to re-releasing their classic games. And here's hoping that maybe one day we could see a resurgence of these mini consoles, or just something sort of similar to it. Like, maybe instead of just like one mini console at a time, maybe they could do like an ultimate console, right? I feel like that'd be a happy middle ground, like the ultimate Nintendo console. You got some of the best of the GameCube, N64, SNES, NES, Game Boy Advance, all that, and you pay like $150 or something like that, and you just get it all in one machine. And obviously then the community could go through and mod it or whatever, but I feel like that'd be a happy middle ground. I feel like that'd be pretty rad. But anyways, yeah, that's my thoughts on all the mini console / classic consoles from the mid-2010s. I've always loved these things, so I just figured it's about time that we sat down and talked about it. But anyway, as always, massive shout out, thank you to all the patrons and channel members sticking on the low ball tier, and a big shout out to the mid ball tier, middle last king, and be daddy manny, and the big shout out to the G tier, run events on the cheese curl. Thank you guys so much, guys, are little legends. I love you. Good on you, arigato gozaimasu. Have an amazing day, stay beautiful. I love you all. Peace.